So there's a detail in that story that Kent just read that always kind of bugs me every time I read the story. And I don't know if you caught it and if it bugs you too. But the story begins with Jesus being outside the temple early one morning, and he's teaching. And he's approached by scribes and Pharisees, the leaders of the Jewish community, and they are bringing with them a woman. And they position that woman right in the middle of the crowd, right in front of Jesus. And then they say to Jesus that this woman has been caught, and I quote, in the very act of committing adultery. And then they remind Jesus that the penalty, according to the laws of Moses, for being caught in the act of adultery is death. And not just any death, but a torturous death, death by stoning, where people pick up rocks and stones and they throw it at the person until the person dies. And so then they decide to try to test Jesus, to sort of trap him, and they ask him what he thinks should happen to this woman. And it's a trap because if he says, well, she ought to be let go, then that means he's encouraging people not to follow the laws of Moses. But if he says the laws of Moses should be followed and she should be put to death, then what that means is that he's not really practicing what he preaches, because he's been preaching about God being loving and merciful. And in the midst of that interaction with those scribes and Pharisees, the scripture says that twice Jesus bends down and with his finger he starts to write in the ground. What did he write? We have no idea. The gospel writer John never tells us what Jesus wrote, and that drives me crazy. I want to know what Jesus was writing. It also bothers me that if the woman was caught in the act of adultery, clearly there was another person involved, and I don't know where that person is. But it also really bothers me that John didn't write down what Jesus was writing. Was he making a list of pros and cons as he decided how he was going to respond to the scribes and Pharisees? Was he making a list of the sins he knew they had committed so that maybe he could embarrass them just as they had embarrassed this woman? Or was he just doodling, buying his time, adding a little dramatic tension to the scene as he formulated his response? We are never going to know. But what we can know is that in that moment, in that interaction, Jesus transformed a situation, one that was full of conflict and with the potential for violence, into a situation of kindness. Kindness that required some courage and some thought. And what we can also know is that it's that kind of kindness that we just might need now more than ever. Now, Jesus masterfully responds to the test, to the trap that those scribes and Pharisees put before him, because what he says to them is, okay, whoever is without sin, whoever has never made a mistake, can be the first one to pick up a stone and throw it. And every single person walks away. And then he turns to the woman and he basically says to her, okay, you made a mistake, but now you have a second chance. You have a second chance to go out there and live your life. So go out and sin no more. He wasn't suggesting that she hadn't made a mistake. He admitted that she had broken one of the laws of Moses. But rather than condemn her now and forevermore, there was a kindness of forgiveness and offering a second chance and saying to the woman, go out and live your life and try to live it more faithfully. Sometimes that's the kind of kindness people need, a kindness that includes some forgiveness and the opportunity to try again, to have a second chance. There's a short story that's entitled A Busload of Kindness, and in it the author Jenny Wyatt writes about a Greyhound bus trip she took from Salt Lake City, Utah to Tacoma, Washington. She had just been getting over the flu, and so since it was New Year's Eve when she was taking this bus trip, she was really hoping that everybody would be out partying or at home, and so the bus would not be very crowded and it would be nice and quiet and she could sleep during this 24-hour trip. But it turned out to be the exact opposite. The bus was absolutely packed, and she got one of the very last seats, second last row, and she was sort of squeezed in. Now, the woman across the aisle from her was an older woman who was sitting very quietly and calmly, but right behind Jenny were two guys, Opie and Carl, who thought that a bus ride was the perfect place to celebrate the new year. And so as midnight approached, even though everyone else on the bus was clearly trying to nap, they loudly and boisterously started counting down to midnight. Well, that caught the bus driver's attention, and so he pulled the bus over, and he went back to Carl and Opie and discovered not only were they being loud and boisterous, but they were also drinking, which was against the rules of the bus. And so he informed them that they were going to have to get off at the next stop. Well, immediately Opie got very somber and started to talk to the bus driver and explained to the bus driver that he was very sorry for his behavior. He was going to Tacoma to begin a new job, and if he didn't get there on time to be picked up to start his new job, the job was going to vanish. Well, the bus driver wasn't interested in hearing any excuses, so he walked to the front of the bus, started to drive again, and so Opie came forward and really started pleading with the bus driver, saying, I have to have this job. I know we made a mistake. I know we broke the rules, but please, can I stay on the bus? Well, and the more Opie talked, the more irritated the bus driver became and said, go back to your seat, sit down, or I'm going to pull over on the side of this mountainous, snowy, curvy road, and you'll just have to get off right here. So Opie turned around and walked back to his seat, and everybody on the bus could see his sad and despairing face. And so the woman across from Jenny was the first. She stood up and yelled to the bus driver, if you make Carl and Opie get off the bus, you're going to have to make me get off the bus too. And then another passenger, and another, until everybody was standing up and the bus driver caved in and said as long as the two behaved better, they could stay on the bus so Opie could get to Tacoma and to his new job. On a bus, in the middle of the night on New Year's Eve, on a curvy, mountainous, snowy road, people stood up and they showed a kindness recognizing that sometimes people make mistakes, and what they need is forgiveness and given a second chance. Sometimes that's what we need. People gave that to Opie that night. Jesus offered that to the woman when she was presented to him outside the temple one early morning. Sometimes that's a kind of kindness we need to give or to receive. And more, there's a kind of kindness that shows up and stands up to violence, that works to avoid or to transform violent situations to peaceful interactions. There's a kind of kindness that stands up even in the midst of the most horrific and terrifying violent moments. Have no doubt that the crowd outside that temple that early morning would have felt completely justified in carrying out the death penalty. That was the law of Moses. It was what was expected. And yet in that moment, Jesus showed a kind of kindness and transformed that potentially violent moment into a moment of courageous kindness and into a peaceful moment. Last March, you may remember the story of Tracy Tong. She was on a subway in New York City She had just moved from Buffalo, New York, back to New York City, and this was her first subway ride since she had returned to the city. And as she was on the subway, she thought it was just going to be another regular day in her life. But as she was on the subway, she heard a woman start to verbally, abusively, violently attack a couple that was sitting on the subway. The woman of the couple was wearing a hijab. And so this woman was just saying to her, "Who do you think you are? Why do you think you can ride on this subway? You're not from here. I'm from here. I belong here. You don't belong here. You have no right to be here." And Tracy Tong, who has a Chinese father and a Latina mother, could not stand it. She herself had experienced so much bullying in her own life that she stood up to that woman and said, "You need to stop saying those things." She wanted that couple to feel welcome and protected and safe on that subway, so she stood up. She brought a kindness into that situation that stood up, and she stopped that flow of violent verbal abuse. And then there's this week. There's this week. 58 innocent lives lost, and more than 500 people injured in a violent act. It happened this week. And yet, in the midst of that terrible, horrific violence, there were so many people who stood up and showed up with kindness in the midst of that violence. Now, for some reason, it's important for me to say that sometimes we come up with sermon ideas pretty much on the spot, pretty quickly. I've been working on the themes of this sermon for a couple of weeks and what I felt that this particular story had to say. So it is my deepest, most profound desire that I did not have fresh stories to tell you about kindness showing up in the midst of violence. I wish what happened in Las Vegas had never happened. And yet it did. And there are such incredible stories of people in the midst of panic, risking their own lives to show a kindness that was so courageous to others. One of the first videos I saw was of a woman near the stage who fell, clearly having been shot, and people start to run past, and then they realize she's down and she's hurt, and they come back and they pick her up and they say, "Come on, we've got to keep going." There are shots ringing out all around them. There's the couple who used their pickup truck to have people placed in it because they couldn't get enough ambulances there. And they rushed those people to a hospital to receive care, and they returned to that dangerous situation in order to pick up more people and take them in order to receive care. There's the 30-year-old copy machine repairman, Jonathan Smith, who is credited with saving more than 30 lives because as he realized what was happening, he just shouted, "Shooter, shooter," and started to herd people together and to take them to one of the airport parking lots nearby so that people could find shelter behind parked cars. He noticed two of the girls he'd helped herd were standing up too tall and they weren't really sheltered, so he stood up to tell them to get down, and he was shot twice. Once in the neck, an off-duty San Diego police officer came to him and started trying to stop the blood flow. And that young man is probably going to live the rest of his life with that bullet lodged in his neck. There's the 5-year-old Aiden, who somehow got separated from his entire family. And Lindsay Rogers, who's just 26 years old, grabs him. Shots are ringing out all around. She grabs him, starts putting his picture on Instagram and Facebook so that possibly his family could recognize him and they could be reunited. There's a nurse who talked about how terrible she feels that she couldn't help other people, but she had 3 wounds herself and was trying to get out of that spot, that concert lawn. In the midst of horrendous violence, people stood up with incredible kindness. In the midst of violence, kindness showed up and transformed that experience for so many people. That is a courageous kindness. There's a kindness that says, yeah, people make mistakes and they need a second chance. And there is a kindness that works to avoid violence and that will even show up in the midst of violence. And then there's a kind of kindness that challenges how we think, how we choose to live our lives, on what decisions, how we make our decisions. Part of what Jesus was doing in that interaction with those scribes and Pharisees was to challenge them about how they think. Were the laws that they were following laws of justice and mercy, of love and of kindness? Jesus was challenging the laws of Moses, those sacred laws, and asking, are those the laws we should still continue to follow? Are those laws that express kindness to all? So truly, how? How can we not, given all of the mass shootings that we continue to experience, how can we not, as people, ask whether or not we have the right laws and whether or not there needs to be more gun control? How can we not ask those questions? Last weekend, I was having a conversation with my son, Matt, who is a first-year student out in California. And he was talking to me about a 2-day concert festival he wants to go to in Los Angeles. As we were talking, he was wondering about the financial cost and whether or not he thought it would be okay to spend the money on that concert. Honestly, I think he was going for guilt because the concert is the same weekend as Parents' Weekend, and Jim and I can't go. So I think he was saying, well, you could spend the money on the concert, right? But as I talked to Matt, and as this week went on, I realized I was no longer just worried about the financial cost, but if he goes to a 2-day festival in LA for music, is it also going to cost him his life? I know we're not supposed to let violent acts or acts of terror to change. We're supposed to boldly go on with our lives. But what have I done? What have I done to make this country, this world safer? What have we done? What have our leaders done to make this world safer? We got to ask the questions. At the very least, we need to look at the research of it all. You know, in 1996, an Arkansas Republican Senator, Jay Dickey, introduced an amendment, legislation, to prevent the Center of Disease Control from being funded in order to study whether there's a connection between firearms ownership and public health. Since 1996, there has been no funding for that research. Jay Dickey himself regrets and apologizes for the legislation that he introduced. But at the very least, we need to start looking and researching, because at the vigil on Tuesday night, every speaker, and especially John Rosenthal, who is a local business owner, a gun owner, and one of the co-founders of an organization looking at gun violence, everybody said we have to do something about this epidemic of gun violence in our country. Outside of the temple one morning, Jesus was put to a test, and he aced that test masterfully. He talked about kindness, kindness that forgives and offers a second chance, kindness that says violence isn't the answer, and kindness that says, are the laws or the choices we make, how we live our lives, are they based on mercy, love, and kindness? The question for us this morning is, how are we going to do on that test? Amen.